Nahjul-Balagha, while ascribing all the attributes of perfection to Allah, the Exalted One, negates any separation of these attributes from His essence and does not consider them as an appendage of the divine essence. On the other hand, the Ash'arites, as we know, consider the divine attributes to be additional to the essence. So the Mu'tazilites negate all attributes. An Ash'arite believes in the separation of the attributes from the essence. A Mu'tazilite speaks of subservience of the attributes to the essence. This has led some people to imagine that the discourses found in Nahjul-Balagha on this topic are fabrications of a later period, under the influence of Mu'tazilite views, whereas anyone with some insight can readily perceive that the attributes negated by Nahjul-Balagha with respect to the divine essence are qualities of imperfection and limitation. The divine essence, being infinite and limitless, necessitates identity of the attributes with the essence, not negation of the attributes as professed by the Mu'tazilites. Had the Mu'tazilites reached such a notion, they would never have negated the divine attributes, considering them subservient to the essence. The same is true of the views on the creating or temporality of the Holy Quran in Sermon 184. One may imagine that these passages of Nahjul-Balagha relate to the latter heated controversies among the Islamic theologians regarding the eternity or temporality of the Holy Quran, and which might have been added to Nahjul-Balagha during the latter centuries. However, a little reflection will reveal that the discourses of Nahjul-Balagha relevant to this issue have nothing to do with the debate on the Holy Quran being either created or uncreated, which was a meaningless controversy, but relevant to the creative command and to the will of the Almighty. Imam Ali says that Allah's will and command represent the divine acts and therefore are posterior to the essence, for if the command and the will were co-eternal and identical with His essence, they will have necessarily to be considered His associates and equals. Imam Ali says the following: when He decrees the creation of a thing, He says to it, "Be," and it assumes existence, but not through an audible voice that strikes the ear or a cry that can be heard. Indeed, the speech of Allah, glory be to Him, is but His created act, which did not exist before it came into existence. Had it, the divine speech, been itself eternal, it would be another God besides Him.
In addition, there are other musnad traditions on this subject related from Imam Ali, only some of which have been collected in Nahjul-Balagha and can be traced back to his time. On this basis, there is no room for doubting their genuineness. If any superficial resemblance is observed between the statements made by Imam Ali and some views held by the Mu'tazilites, the probability to be allowed in this connection is that some of his ideas were adopted by the Mu'tazilites. The controversies of the Muslim theologians, both the Shia and the Sunni, the Ash'arites as well as the Mu'tazilites, generally revolved around the doctrine of rational basis of ethical judgment concerning good and evil. This doctrine, nothing but a practical principle operating in the human society, is considered by the theologians to be also applicable to the divine sphere and govern the laws of creation, but we find no trace of it in Nahjul-Balagha. Similarly, there is no sign of it in the Holy Quran. Had the ideas and beliefs of the theologians found their way into Nahjul-Balagha, first of all, the traces of this doctrine should have been found in that book. Some others, having come across certain words such as existence, non-existence, temporality, and pre-eternity, and so on in Nahjul-Balagha, have been led to assume that these terms entered the Muslim intellectual world under the influence of the Greek philosophy and were inserted, intentionally or unintentionally, into the discourses of Imam Ali. Had those who advocate this view gone deeper into the meanings of these words, they would not have heeded such a hypothesis. The method and approach adopted in the arguments of Nahjul-Balagha are completely different from those of the philosophers who lived before Sa'id ar-Radi or during his time, or even those born many centuries after the compilation of Nahjul-Balagha. Presently, we shall not discuss the metaphysics of the Greek or of the Alexandrian philosophy, but shall confine ourselves to the metaphysical views propounded by Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and Khwaja Nasir al-Din al-Tusi. Undoubtedly, Muslim philosophers introduced new challenges into philosophy under the influence of Islamic teachings, which had not existed before, and in addition to them, introducing radically original ways of demonstration and inference to explain and argue their points with regard to some other problems. Nevertheless, what we learn from Nahjul-Balagha is obviously different from this approach. My teacher, Allama Tabatabai, in the preface to his discourse on the traditions of Islamic scholarship, writes the following: these statements help resolve a number of problems of theological philosophy. Apart from the fact that Muslims were not acquainted with these notions and they were incomprehensible to the Arabs, basically there is no trace of them in the writings and statements of pre-Islamic philosophers, whose books were translated into Arabic, and similarly they do not appear in the works of Muslim philosophers, Arab or Persian. These problems remained obscure and unintelligible, and every commentator discussed them according to his own conjecture, until the 11th century of the Hijra. Only then were they properly understood for the first time, that is, the problem of the true unity of the necessary being, a non-numerical unity. The problem that the proof of the existence of the necessary being is identical with the proof of his unity, since the necessary being is absolute existence. His being implies his unity. The problem that the necessary existent is the one known in his essence. The necessary being is known directly without the need of an intermediary, and that the reality of everything else is known through the necessary being, not vice versa.
The arguments of early Muslim philosophers like Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, and Khwaja Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, such as the discussions on the divine essence and attributes like unity, simplicity, self-sufficiency, knowledge, power, will, providence, and so on, revolve around the conception of the necessity of existence, from which all of them are derived, and the necessity of existence itself is indirectly deduced. In this fashion, it is demonstrated that the existence of all possible existent beings cannot be explained without assuming the existence of the necessary being. Although the argument used for proving the truth of this argument cannot be called a demonstration of the impossible, in view of its indirect mode of inference, it resembles such a demonstration, and hence it fails to provide a completely satisfactory demonstration, for it does not explain the necessity of the existence of the necessary being. Ibn Sina, in his Al-Isharat, claims that he has succeeded in discovering the why of it, and hence chooses to call his argument the proof of the truthful. However, the later philosophers considered his exposition of the why as insufficient. In Nahjul-Balagha, the necessity of existence is never used to explain the existence of possible beings. That on which this book relies for this purpose is the real criterion of the necessity of existence, that is, the absolute reality and the pure being of the divine essence. Allama Tabatabai, in the above-mentioned work, while explaining one hadith by Imam Ali found in Al-Tawhid of Sheikh al-Saduq, says the following: "The basis of our discussion rests upon the principle that the divine being is a reality that does not accept any limits or restrictions whatsoever. Because Allah, the Most Exalted, is the absolute reality from whom the existence of all other beings is derived within the ontological limits and characteristics peculiar to themselves, and their existence depends on that of this absolute being." In Nahjul-Balagha, the very basis of all discussions revolving on the divine essence rests on the status that Allah is the absolute and infinite being who transcends all limits and finitude. No point of space, time, or anything at all is devoid of him. He is with everything, in everything, yet nothing is with him or in him. Since he is the absolute and the infinite, he transcends time, number, limit, and proximity. That is, time and space, number, and limit are applicable to a lower stage, the stage of the divine actions and of creation. Everything is from him and returns to him. He is the first of the first and the last of the last. He precedes everything and succeeds everything.
This is the idea that forms the axis of all discourses of Nahjul-Balagha, and of which there is no trace in the works of Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, Al-Ghazali, and Khwaja Nasir al-Din al-Tusi. As pointed out by Allama Tabatabai, these profound discussions of theology proper are based on a series of interrelated problems which have been posited in metaphysics. An elaborate discussion of those theological problems and their relevant issues mentioned above is outside the scope of our present discussion. The turning point in recognizing the true originality and authenticity of Nahjul-Balagha's theological discussions comes when we understand the fundamental distinction between its approach and that of the philosophers and theologians who came later. There are two decisive reasons for rejecting the claims that the theological discussions of Nahjul-Balagha were inventions of later writers familiar with philosophical notions. Firstly, the kind of problems discussed in Nahjul-Balagha were not at all raised by any philosopher till the time of Sayyid Aradi, the compiler of Nahjul-Balagha. That the unity of the necessary being is not of the numerical kind, and that the divine essence precedes number, that the existence of the necessary being implies its unity, the simple reality of the necessary being, his immanence, and other such notions were not known to philosophy during or before Sayyid Aradi's times. These concepts were so profound and original that they took centuries for philosophers to even begin to formulate. They were not the product of gradual philosophical development. They were the fruits of divine inspiration that flowed through Imam Ali. Secondly, the axes of arguments presented in this book are altogether different from the axes of philosophical discussions which have been prevalent throughout history until the present day. The philosophers approached the question of the divine essence through the concept of the necessity of existence, deriving all other attributes from this conception. Their arguments were indirect and often failed to provide complete satisfaction. Imam Ali's approach, on the other hand, began with the absolute reality and pure being of the divine essence. He did not argue from the existence of possible beings to the existence of the necessary being. He started with the absolute and infinite, and from there explained everything else. This is a radically different approach, one that is more direct, more profound, and more in line with the teachings of the Holy Quran.
The concept that the divine essence is absolute reality that does not accept any limits or restrictions whatsoever is the cornerstone of Nahjul-Balagha's theology. This is not a concept that can be found in Greek philosophy or in the works of later Muslim philosophers. It is a concept that flows directly from the Quranic understanding of Tawhid. It is the understanding that Allah is not merely the greatest being among beings, but the absolute reality from whom all other beings derive their existence. He is not confined by time, space, number, or limit. He transcends all categories and is beyond all comprehension. Yet he is with everything and in everything, while nothing is with him or in him. This is the profound paradox that lies at the heart of Nahjul-Balagha's theology. This understanding has profound implications for how we conceive of the divine attributes. If Allah is the absolute and infinite, then his attributes are not separate from his essence. They are identical with it. His knowledge is not something that exists alongside his essence. It is his essence knowing. His power is not something that exists alongside his essence. It is his essence acting. His will is not something that exists alongside his essence. It is his essence willing. This is the doctrine of the identity of attributes with the essence that runs throughout Nahjul-Balagha. It is a doctrine that avoids the errors of both the Ash'arites, who separated the attributes from the essence, and the Mu'tazilites, who negated the attributes altogether. It is a doctrine that is firmly rooted in the Quranic understanding of Tawhid. The same is true of Imam Ali's teachings on the creative command and the will of Allah. When he says that Allah's speech is his created act, which did not exist before it came into existence, he is making a profound theological point. He is saying that the divine speech is not eternal and identical with the essence. If it were, it would be another God besides him. Rather, the divine speech is an act of the divine will, and it is posterior to the essence. This is a point that is completely different from the later debates about whether the Quran is created or uncreated. Those debates were often meaningless, focusing on a question that missed the deeper point. Imam Ali's teaching is concerned with the nature of the divine act and the relationship between the divine essence and its acts. It is a much deeper and more profound discussion.
The originality and authenticity of Nahjul-Balagha's teachings are further confirmed by the fact that these concepts were not known to the philosophers who came later. As Allama Tabatabai has pointed out, these problems remained obscure and unintelligible until the 11th century of the Hijra. Only then were they properly understood for the first time. This is a clear indication that they were not the product of philosophical speculation that was later inserted into Nahjul-Balagha. Rather, they were the product of divine inspiration that was far ahead of its time. Imam Ali was speaking on a level that would take centuries for human reason to even begin to comprehend. This is the legacy of Nahjul-Balagha. It is a legacy of profound theological insight that was centuries ahead of its time. It is a legacy that challenges us to think deeply, to question our assumptions, and to seek the truth with intellectual honesty and spiritual sincerity. It is a legacy that has the power to guide us through the complexities of our own time and to illuminate our understanding of the divine. The controversy between the Ash'arites and the Mu'tazilites over the nature of the divine attributes was a historical accident that occurred long after the time of Imam Ali. It is absurd to suggest that Imam Ali's teachings were influenced by either of these schools. If anything, it was these schools that were influenced, consciously or unconsciously, by the teachings of Imam Ali. The Mu'tazilites may have adopted some of his ideas, but they did so imperfectly, and they failed to grasp the full depth of his teachings. The Ash'arites, on the other hand, completely missed the point. They separated the attributes from the essence, falling into a form of multiplicity that is incompatible with true Tawhid. The true understanding of Tawhid is the one that is found in Nahjul-Balagha. It is the understanding that Allah is the absolute and infinite reality, that his attributes are identical with his essence, and that he transcends all limits and categories. This is the understanding that we must strive to attain. It is the understanding that will bring us closer to Allah and help us to live our lives in accordance with his will. May Allah grant us the wisdom to understand the teachings of Nahjul-Balagha and the strength to live by them. May he guide us to the true understanding of Tawhid and protect us from the errors of those who deviate from his path. May he bless Imam Ali and the Al-Bayt and make us among those who follow their noble example. Amin.